From the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado, this is Day 5 of the 2020 Aspen Ideas Festival. From the Institute campus, the co-founder of the Aspen Ideas Festival, Vice President of Public Programs for the Aspen Institute, Kitty Boone.
Hello, and welcome to the final day of the 2020 Aspen Ideas Festival. Moving a festival like this online hasn't been easy, but I'm thrilled with the wonderful sessions that our panelists, interviewers, artists, and thinkers have been able to bring to you to date, and there's more to come tonight. Of course, none of this could have happened without the tireless work of the staff of the Aspen Institute and our generous sponsors. We've learned a lot this year, and I mean that in the way that I always do, that this is an inspiring and educational event, and every person who joined us on camera has done us a tremendous favor, and for that I thank them all deeply. But I also mean that we've learned a lot about ways to communicate and come together. We've learned that there are lots of small problems that can be overcome in pursuit of a big idea. We've learned that our annual Aspen Ideas Festival is so much more than a gathering of passionate people in a stunningly beautiful place, that it can be a global force for good, unencumbered by the capacity of a tent. Next year, we hope to gather in person again, confident that some of the great ideas from this week's sessions will have made us a safer society. But we also plan to incorporate what we've learned as we've gathered remotely and as we invite the whole world to our table. Going forward, we will find more ways to host a global conversation. If you've come away from these sessions more informed, more energized, more inspired, we'd like to invite you to join us in person in Aspen next year. We'll have all the hindsight of 2020 and all the promise of the years to come at your feet. Thank you so much. On to tonight.
Day 5's lineup includes fresh, big ideas. Mitt Romney and Lonnie Chen, Michael Eric Dyson, Alicia Garza, and Eugene Scott. Krista Tippett in conversation with Lulu Miller. Aspen Institute President and CEO Dan Porterfield in conversation with Brian Greene. And an Ideas Festival exclusive performance with our friend, violinist Robert McDuffie. Also, we'll share a clip from our archives of the late Reverend Peter Gomes. And now, to start us off, a big idea.
I'm Zinklea Samoa, journalist at Now This News, artist and host of our daily news show, Know This. In 2015, I was in Ferguson, Missouri, documenting protests following the death of Michael Brown. One of the hardest parts of that reporting experience was actually returning home from my assignment to a news cycle and a nation that had seemingly moved on entirely. Today, we're at a similar inflection point. Protests have called for justice for George Floyd, news stories are exploring the nuance of America's racial traumas, and communities are getting informed and mobilized. Which leads to my big idea. We must reimagine the way we consume news, making it an intentional spiritual practice for individuals. What might it look like for you to develop a rhythm where you consume fact-based, diverse sources, including those outside of your comfort zone? Then, with intention, step away and discern how to respond in your life. 2020 has been anything but predictable, and I believe the outcome of this reimagined approach will allow the news at its best to be an informational compass for us, guiding us through the uncertainties of life, fostering empathy, and connecting us to new stories and communities. We have the agency to consume news in the same way one might enter into a spiritual or mindfulness practice, with sensitivity, openness, and intention to learn, grow, and act.
Our first Aspen Ideas conversation is with Lonnie Chen and Mitt Romney.
Hello, I'm Lonnie Chen, fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Mitt Romney, United States Senator for Utah. Thanks for joining us, Senator Romney.
Thanks, Lonnie. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. I want to start by asking about something that goes back to actually your campaign in 2012, when you talked about Russia as America's #1 geopolitical adversary. Fast forward a few years, you give your maiden speech to the United States Senate last year, and you say China is poised to take over that dubious title. Do you think China is there now? Has China taken over as America's #1 geopolitical adversary?
Yeah, I think we have to look at the reality, which is China's GDP is obviously much, much greater than that of Russia. At the same time, China has made enormous strides not only economically, but geopolitically and militarily. They're flexing their muscle in Hong Kong. They're flexing their muscles in the region with the Philippines, with the Solomon Islands. They're more and more hostile domestically with regards to the Uyghurs and other minorities and religions. So, yeah, they're taking on a role not as provocative visually as perhaps Russia from day to day, but without question, they are the geopolitical adversary, competitor, hopefully not threat, but they're the geopolitical adversary that we're going to face over the coming century.
Do you think that some of what's happened with the coronavirus pandemic over these last several months, how do you think that's made things worse, or do you think it's made things worse?
Well, certainly it's made things worse for a lot of people, and terrible for the economy, and terrible for the public health of the world and our own nation. Geopolitically, it opens a bit of a window for us to take advantage, in my view, of the one thing that is essential for us to divert China from the path they're on, which is a confrontational path. And that diversion will only be effective if we can link with other free nations or other nations that just play by the rules of economic trade. If we can work together, collaboratively reach an approach to how we're going to deal with China, to have them understand what those rules will be and tell them, look, if you don't abide by these rules, and the consequences are going to be more painful for you, at least economically, than if you do abide by them. And that can't happen with just the U.S. speaking. If all that happens is the U.S. flexing our muscles get smaller and smaller relative to China's muscles as time goes on, if we're together with the rest of the world while we have dramatic impact.
Yeah, and it seems also, by the way, we don't necessarily have a great sense of what China's military capacity is, because a lot of times there's not great transparency about what China's doing in that regard. I understand that you've been involved in some efforts maybe to get us a better sense of how we might compare, for example, what we do with our military spending with what they do. Can you talk a little bit about some of those efforts?
Yeah, I'll just step back for a second and just note, China has made it very clear they want to become the military leader of the world, as well as the economic leader and the geopolitical leader. And they've made progress on all three. We don't see as clearly what's happening on the military front. We take enormous pride in the fact that we spend almost $1 trillion a year on military, if you include veterans benefits. And yet if you pierce how we spend that money, you find out that only about 15% is spent on procurement. And so then if you look at China and see how they're spending their money, and of course their cost of construction and personnel is much, much lower than ours, you find out that on a apples to apples basis, we're getting about the same procurement per year. So China is really arming in a way that's equivalent to the whole United States of America. And we, of course, have armament that's necessary to be deployed in missions around the world. They're focused on one region. If this keeps up very long, they're going to be the dominant military power in that region. And that's why you see the Philippines rethinking their military alliance with us. You see the Solomon Islands push off Taiwan. And I don't mean the Philippines are going to link with China. I just mean that the joint relationship we've had has been jeopardized by virtue of their latest understanding. So, China is a very significant military presence in the region and ultimately in the world, and we do not capture that. And you're right, I have added an amendment to this year's Defense Authorization Act, which would require our government to finally prepare an apples-to-apples comparison of their military procurement with our own.
You mentioned some of the challenges that China creates in its own neighborhood in the Indo-Pacific region with some of its neighbors. What does that say about what the United States needs to be doing in terms of our engagement in the region? And talk about both the military and diplomatic and economic dimensions of that.
I think there was a time when America's lead was so dramatic, militarily, economically, geopolitically, that basically we said something and the whole world listened. And many people got in line because we said something. That's becoming harder and harder, not because we're weaker, but because the rest of the world has become stronger, particularly China, but other nations like South Korea. South Korea is now deemed to be the most technologically advanced nation in the world. So everyone doesn't jump just because America speaks. And what that means is for us to have the kind of power to dissuade nations from doing something that's not in the interest of America or interest of the world, we're best off if we're able to have close working relationships with other nations. And that means with our friends. It doesn't just mean with our enemies, it means getting closer to our friends. So in the region, of course, it means Australia, it means Japan, it means South Korea. I also believe it's important for us to have a good relationship with Taiwan. I mean, these are nations which collectively will, in my view, be able to help keep China from taking a course which continues to be excessively predatory.
So one of the things that China really has focused on in some ways is looking inward and figuring out, particularly for Xi Jinping, how to consolidate more authority and power. One of the issues that's been in the headlines, particularly over these last several days, has been Hong Kong and what they've done with respect to passing a national security law for Hong Kong. How concerned should Americans be, Senator Romney, about what's happening in Hong Kong? And I guess why should it matter to a certain degree?
Well, what you're seeing in Hong Kong is outrageous as it relates to the people of Hong Kong, which are a freedom-loving, capable people. But it's also an indication of the direction that China is headed. What they have done, whether in Tibet or what they've done with the Uyghurs or what they do with Christian faiths in China, what they do in Hong Kong, all those things are related. And it's not going to stop with Hong Kong. They will continue their effort of pressure on their neighbors and ultimately perhaps subject them in one way or another. So we stand for Hong Kong, for the people there, but we also stand for other nations who will be next in line. And this is something where, again, we will be able to have the greatest impact if we speak with not just our voice, but with the voices of all the nations of the free world. And I say this because if only America objects, for instance, to the way the people of Hong Kong are being treated, or the Uyghurs are being treated, well, then China is able to point and say, oh, this is just America. This is just that terrible country that doesn't know how to manage its own COVID. But if instead you have 50 or 100 nations come out and condemn what's being done to the Uyghurs or condemn what's happening in Hong Kong and do it on a collective basis, China, they care about their geopolitical future and they don't want to have the whole world against them.
Let's talk a bit about the economic relationship between the U.S. and China, because that obviously has been a focus of the last several years. In terms of what's coming next, we had this trade deal we did with China last year. There's been some conversation about whether the coronavirus pandemic has derailed the possibility of a future trade deal with China. Where do you think things stand in terms of our economic relationship with China? And do you think that another trade deal is the right answer?
I don't mind the trade deals. I don't mind an effort to have China buy more American products. But the real challenge that we have with regards to China's activity relates to their predatory business practices, basically not playing by the rules of fair trade around the world. And just to give one example, and that is predatory pricing, which is it's illegal in almost every developed country within a country for a company, for instance, to say, I'm going to go into a new area with my product and I'm going to price it substantially below cost and I'll subsidize that business or that area that I've gone into with the profits from my other businesses. And then when I've driven the competitors out of business, then we'll raise prices again. It's called predatory pricing. It's illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act here. I know it's illegal almost to places all over the world. Well, China doesn't have a rule like that as it applies to competing outside China. And so they'll go into a marketplace with steel or stainless steel or commuter cars or semiconductors, you name it. They will go in. The government will subsidize on a massive basis that particular company or that particular industry until it's driven the competition out of business, at which point it raises prices and then takes a new area for its focus. And they're doing that time and time again. They will drive the most important high technology businesses of the future out of business, one after the other, until the world comes together and says, no, you can't do that. You've got to play by the same rules that we all play by, because markets can't work if we don't have people playing by the rules. I mean, I'm a free market guy, but if somebody's cheating, you don't have a free market anymore. So we have to make it very clear on a global basis that to have continued access to our markets on an unfettered basis, that China has to play by the rules. I believe they will if they're confronted on a global basis. But if it's just one country asking for to buy more soybeans, they'll say, sure, we'll buy some more soybeans, which they may or may not do, but they're going to go after our computers, our aircraft, our military hardware. I mean, they're going to go our communications technology, our pharmaceuticals, our artificial intelligence. They're going to go after each area, one after the other, driving the American businesses, Western businesses, free market businesses out of the marketplace and dominate the world economically. That's where they're headed. And we're all sitting back worried about whether they'll buy some more soybeans. Look, I love people buying more soybeans. The American farmer needs some help. But we got a bigger problem with China than that alone.
Do you think that we need to be more aggressive in, for example, moving supply chains for critical products back here to the U.S. so that we're not reliant on China? So people have talked about pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, particularly in the wake of this coronavirus pandemic. Do policymakers need to be a little bit more forward-leaning in that regard?
Well, I actually think that with regards to products that are essential to national security, that we should have a policy that we reach with our friends and neighbors of saying, look, we're only going to buy these products from free nations. And so when something like the communication systems are going to get upgraded to 5G, we say, look, we're not necessarily going to insist that 5G be made only by a U.S. company, but it's got to be made by a free nation. And we'll buy it from Nokia or from whomever, but it has to be made by a free nation because we can't have products that are essential to our national security being made by a nation which has as its ambition the dominance of the world. And so that, in my opinion, is something that we're going to have to get to. But that's a small part, if you will, of the global trade and the global economy. And so I would look to bring everything back. We want America to be the most competitive. We wish everybody would bring everything here because we're most effective and most competitive. But with regards to national security elements critical to our national security, I think we ought to be buying those from free nations.
Do you think that, as you look ahead, do you think there is a huge or a large divergence in terms of how, for example, President Trump might deal with China in a second term versus, what we might see from the alternative, from Vice President Biden?
I haven't really heard either the current president or Joe Biden, former vice president, describe what their overall policy would be with regards to China. I don't know that it's great electoral politics to be talking about working together with other nations to work on a collaborative approach. I've proposed an amendment again to the Defense Authorization Act, which calls for nations of the Pacific to work with us to develop a strategy relating to China. These are things, I think behind the scenes, they just happen to be critically important. I mean, of the great challenges America faces over the next several decades, without question, at the very top of this list, there are two or three things, and one of them is the emergence of China as a nation which seeks to put us in the rearview mirror, economically, militarily, and geopolitically. That's a very different world. And tariff policies, they may play a role, but only if they're linked with our friends around the world, so that China recognizes they can't keep playing the way they've been playing and get away with it. But if it's only us, well, there are a lot of other markets they can go to. And they will negotiate with us and they'll agree with us on various things, but it's not tough enough to get them to change their course unless we're the kind of leader that brings other nations of the world together and we confront China in a like manner, not to go to war with them, either economically or otherwise, but to dissuade them from taking a course which is so antithetical to the interest of the world.
So we have just a few minutes left. And I want to end with this question, which is, some characterize the relationship between the U.S. and China as entering a new Cold War. Do you accept that characterization of the relationship? And if you do, what do you think it would take to improve bilateral relations with China going forward?
I think the course we're on and the course China is on, which if continued at some length could ultimately lead to that kind of a a posture, a hostile vision of one another, and nations refusing to trade with each other and basically opposing each other at every turn. I think that's where we're headed, more because of China's actions than ours. China's actions in Hong Kong, their actions at the South China Sea, what they're doing with the Uyghurs and other minorities and religious groups. I mean, these are really outrageous things. And as they continue along that course, I think it's going to be more and more difficult for us to pretend that they're a friend and a collaborating competitor. So what does it mean we got to do? Well, again, I go back to the same theme, which is we're going to have leaders in this country who are willing to sit down and do the hard work of saying, all right, what are the rules that we think are essential in dealing with China and getting them to take a different course than the course that they're on. And that's everything from each segment of our economy to our military preparedness, artificial intelligence, space technology. You take every aspect of this and say, what do we need to do? What are they doing? And then we have to look and say, okay, how do we build a coalition of nations around the world, which I think are anxious for us to do this? How do we build the kind of coalition that America has done time and time again? We built these coalitions in the past when we've had leaders here who are willing to do the hard work of putting that coalition together. I think we have to put that coalition together.
Well, there's no question, Senator, this issue is an important one. In fact, probably, as you noted, the important foreign policy issue for the years and decades to come. So thank you for sharing just a few of your thoughts on this very important issue.
Thanks a lot, He. Good to be with you and our friends at the Aspen Institute.
And now we go to the Big Dipper, not in the sky, but in Anderson Park. Big Dipper is the 1973 work of the German-born Mexican sculptor Matthias Geritz. Viewed from the top, these star-shaped pillars form that most recognizable constellation. And, as is the case in the night sky, the two stars of the Big Dipper's handle point to the North Star. Collaboration was a key component of the Bauhaus ethic, and this piece's thoughtful placement within Anderson Park is a fine example of Bayer's commitment to those ideals. The Aspen Ideas Festival is generously underwritten by Allstate, the Mount Sinai Health System, Prudential, and the Walton Family Foundation, with support from PayPal and the Rise Fund. And now, another big idea.
Hi, I'm Marla Blow with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. My big idea is to close the racial wealth gap. Right now, African Americans have an average household net worth of about $17,000 versus $170,000 for the average white household in this country. If we close that gap by bringing African Americans into the economic system and enabling full participation, we will create $1.5 trillion of incremental GDP for this country over the next decade. That kind of economic opportunity rarely exists, rarely presents itself, and really creates a chance for us to build systems that are fair and robust, to invest in our infrastructure, and build a phenomenal country that will allow us to all hold our heads up high. We've done it once, we can do it again. Let's close that racial wealth gap. Thank you.
Our next Aspen Ideas conversation is with Eugene Scott, Alicia Garza, and Michael Eric Dyson.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation with two people that I've followed for quite some time, and I'm very interested in hearing more about as we try to get our heads around this moment in our time and try to unravel so many of the issues that have occupied so many conversations and move towards a solution to making this world a better place than it was when we all arrived. With me, I have Alicia Garza. She is one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, and she's a principal at Black Futurist Lab. And we also have Michael Eric Dyson, a professor at Georgetown University and author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. There's so many places we can start right now, but I'm very interested in just hearing from you all, when you look back on the past month, we should say, or at least past 3 or 4 weeks, that have led to a national uprising and deep disgust and concern with anti-Black racism and white supremacy across the country in places that we perhaps have never seen this type of response. What are some of the first things and thoughts that come to your mind, Alicia?
Well, first and foremost, you know, it's amazing to see twice in my lifetime now such transformation happening across the country. I know when I talk to my elders, you know, there's a sense that everything is possible right now. And that is also true when I talk to folks in my peer group. I think that, you know, while this is an incredible moment of uprising and an incredible moment of reckoning, I really long for this to also be a moment for change. I think there are a lot of rules that have been rigged against Black communities for a very long time that we need to see the courage and drive the political will to actually start to shift. I think the other thing that's really important right now that is finally becoming a robust national and global conversation is a conversation around policing and safety in our communities. And I feel really good about the reckoning and the grappling that is happening right now, whether you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with the slogan of defund the police. I think it's important for us to be grappling with what actually keeps communities safe in this moment. And when it comes to Black communities in particular, is safety only achieved through punishment, or is safety achieved through making sure that we fix and rebuild the infrastructure that has been denied Black communities for so long?
What about you, Professor Dyson? What are some of the first things that come to your mind about this moment?
Well, like Ms. Garza, it is striking that we have seen yet another uprising, rebellion, resurgence, and revival of a spirit of resistance that has barely been seen in this country since the civil unrest of the 1960s. And it is directly attributable to the work that Ms. Garza and her colleagues have done by ingeniously fostering an environment where a hashtag becomes a statement and principle, an ideal, an aspiration, and a movement. I mean, that's remarkable. That's like joining Chuck Berry, Martin Luther King Jr., Ida B. Wells Barnett, and throwing in some Aretha Franklin. That's just a convergence of so many different aspects of our identities. The civil rights movement stated the goal, the aspiration to gain voting rights in 65, before that, civil rights in 64, and then in the aftermath of Dr. King's death, the Fair Housing Act. But Black Lives Matter is the articulation of an ideal. It's the articulation of a principle. It's the articulation of an aspiration. And it's the articulation of a reaffirmation to Black people. Yeah, Black Lives matter, and they ought to matter. And to see what's going on now, the pushback of Black people to insist that this is the moment. You know, people keep asking me, well, what's different now? What's different now is, it's different now. It's different because people, I've been doing interviews all over the world. They didn't do that before on Mike Brown, and Mike Brown had a national circumference within which his memory took place. But this is a global, if you will, acknowledgement. To match the global pandemic, it's a global explosion of consciousness. And that is attributable to our young, brilliant Black people like Ms. Garza and others who have led the way. Young people have always led the way. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, Diane Nash, Julian Bond, led, of course, by many leaders at multiple sites. It is not a leaderless organization. It is a multiple site of leadership that is articulating goals, ideals, and aspirations. So I am heartened when I see the world has finally caught up to where Black people have been. And I can imagine some Black people are tired. And I tell white people, if you meet one Black person that's tired, go on to the next one. Because we running a relay here. So somebody had the baton and they wore out. But the next person running the leg may not be worn out. So Black communities are heterogeneous. They are differentiated. They are complicated and nuanced. And it is a time not only for white supremacy to be assaulted, which I'm glad. It is not only a time for the dominant white supremacist ideology to be attacked, it is also time for Black people to look inward and understand the resources at our disposal and in connection with other people who have joined the movement. And hallelujah, you got Latinx people, you got Asian folk, you got First Nation folk, you got indigenous folk, you got the Rainbow Coalition for real joining the movement. So when I look out and I see the devastating denial of Black life, Black death as the premise and predicate of American democracy, which it has been, the death of Black aspiration, which is what slavery was about, reinforcing an ideal that we were nothing, to see the uprising of Black people and claiming global recognition has been a remarkable thing. And despite the deaths of Miss Breonna Taylor and Mr. George Floyd and Mr. Ahmaud Arbery and so many countless others, trans people, women, and Black men alike, we have at this moment the possibility of truly and fundamentally transforming politics of police. And I think, and I'll end by saying, yes, Ms. Garza is right. You might be uncomfortable with the notion of defunding the police, but you might not be uncomfortable with the results of what that means. We done tried everything else. We done tried police community relations. We've tried enhancing relations between law enforcement and Black communities. We've tried making them live in the same neighborhood so that they will see a difference. That ain't helping. This is not a policy problem. It is a philosophical problem, and it is a culture problem. The immediate response to see me as a threat and to demonize me, we've got to purge out of the consciousness of these white folk and others, Black people as well, and brown and red and yellow people who police us, an instinct to murder us. You know, when you're driving along, and they've done these psychological studies, when you see somebody come across your horizon, the first thing is to drive toward them before you drive away from them. And so with Black people, we have been that object. You may not be for defunding the police, but I want to take the fun out of killing us. I want to take the fun out of murdering and massacring us. And I want to fund those programs and policies like the ones put forth by Ms. Garza and others that will have the chance of transforming this society in which we live. I will not talk this long again ever, but I had to get that out. I had to recognize Garza. I had to recognize Black Lives Matter, and I had to recognize the moment we're in.
Absolutely. I remember I was a political reporter in 2012 after the Trayvon Martin killing, which was my introduction to Black Lives Matter. I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was, as you know, Phoenix is not a place with a bustling, large Black population. So you would hear about it, but it wasn't what was happening to the degree that we saw in, you know, metropolitan areas with large Black populaces. But then I remember Mike Brown in Ferguson. By that time, I was up in grad school in Boston, and I saw so many protests and responses, and there was attraction that was happening. But this time I saw marches in Alaska and Idaho and Wyoming. And you know, Ms. Garza, I would just love to hear your thoughts as someone who has seen Black Lives Matter go from being painted as this fringe movement by its opponents to this idea and this value that recent surveys say the majority of Americans are behind. What's your thought and your reaction to that?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And judging by what my email inboxes look like, threats and praise alike, I can say that this is 100% a different moment. I think one of the things that I'm grappling with, though, is not around, you know, where were Black folks at, because I feel like Black folks are very clear about the fact that Black lives should matter, and we may have different approaches to how we do that. But I will say that 7 years later, it is important to see white folks now joining this movement. I think there are folks who might say things like, where have y'all been? Because we have been here for almost a decade. But I will also echo the sentiments of Professor Dyson and say that, you know, it's important that you're here now. And the question that I think I grapple with a lot in this moment, when we look at the trajectory and the history of Black Lives Matter, and also the embracing of it now, is that it really is up to us to make this a moment that we capitalize on. And by capitalize, I don't mean, everybody slap Black Lives Matter on your website or on a t-shirt and profit off of it. What I mean here is to actually make Black Lives Matter where you are. The fact of the matter is, if we were together right now in Aspen, we would be having this conversation, right, with an audience that actually doesn't look like this panel. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think actually what needs to happen here is that, when we talk about divesting from systems that don't benefit us, we also have to divest from practices and procedures and policies that don't benefit us either. And so part of what divesting looks like in this case would actually be to figure out, not just how do we diversify our environment, but how do we change how we lead in this moment? How do we change who is leading us in this moment? How do we change how we direct resources and power in this moment? And how do we also shift the way that we understand what Black Lives Matter can mean in our immediate environment, as well as in our communities and in our country and across the globe? And I make this point in particular because I think that, again, judging by what my inbox looks like, both threats and praise, what is true is that there is a major backlash that's happening to the popularity of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has not been as mainstream as it is right now. In 2013, when we started Black Lives Matter and leading all the way up until the 2016 election, saying Black Lives Matter was almost like political suicide. And that's why you couldn't get any major candidate to say it without taking a gulp of water first, right? Because they were very worried about the perceptions that were attached to and wrapped around Black Lives Matter. Of course, we have not been concerned about that because we've always known that we've been on the right side of history. But I can say, just to make a quick parallel, that in the same way that people would tell us now to change the slogan of defund the police to make the police better or transform the police or whatever, people told us this also in 2013 and said, well, how can you make your slogan more appealing to people like me? And I'm really glad that we didn't change our slogan to All Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter too. We've got to be able to, as a part of the reckoning that this moment is offering us, we have to be able to sit with the discomfort of the shifts that we are being asked to make right now. And so lastly, I just want to say that for me, when it comes to reimagining what this moment can and should look like, it also means reimagining the role of white folks in our communities and in our decision-making bodies. It means reimagining the roles in which decision makers have taken up that frankly have disenfranchised Black communities from being able to make decisions about our own lives, and to be able to do that in partnership and in interdependence. I want to be very clear here and very specific that policing is just the tip of the iceberg. Rules and practices and policy and culture needs to shift in our boardrooms and our C-suites, in our schools, in our economy, all throughout our society. So don't think that to be a part of Black Lives Matter, all you need to do is slap it on a t-shirt or on your website or send out an email talking about, how you're committed to diversity and inclusion. Actually think about what that looks like in your boardrooms. Think about what it looks like in your churches and in your workplaces and in your homes. You can make Black Lives Matter exactly where you are right now.
Indeed. I think one of the most interesting things about this moment is seeing the conversation focus on policing, but go beyond issues of public safety as well. Some of the more interesting conversations I've been following have been about the silencing of Black people in the mainstream media, Black and racial issues within the context of white evangelicalism and racism within LGBT communities as well. It's just been incredibly broad in terms of people needing to vocalize how Black lives have not mattered as much as they should have in so many different spaces. And I was very interested, Professor Dyson, as someone who's working with multiple generations, be they, younger millennials and Generation Z, but also your colleagues and your elders. What are some of the new conversations you're hearing that inspire you that perhaps were not being as entertained during previous generations?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, first of all, Black lives have to matter to Black people. And Black lives have to matter in Black minds, right? You remember Martin Luther King Jr. near the end of his life saying, "I'm Black and I'm beautiful." I mean, the predecessor linguistic move before Black Lives Matter that was this national and this branded in both the good and uplifting senses of that word and with the commercial and commodified consequences is Black is beautiful, right? Right. So Black is beautiful was not only an assertion of an aesthetic ideal, it was the assertion of an internal spiritual orientation that permitted us to embrace the beauty of Blackness across the globe and across the spectrum, because we were seen as nasty and ugly, light versus dark, and what was seen as more appealing and what was seen as more demonized. So Black Lives Matter is such an ingenious moment, because the moment becomes a movement, and the moment becomes a means by which we begin to interrogate our own self-destructive practices and the way in which we ain't acknowledge it. So we can be homophobic in Black and say Black Lives Matter, but we're dogging the trans people. And trans people are dying in our communities in devastating ways. We can acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of people who are being killed by police at a certain level are Black men, but to also talk about the way in which Black women's bodies have been policed in so many other ways, not just by the police, right? And so, and let me put in a word here, it's important, and then I'll answer your question for sure. It's important that we talk about the police first, because if you ain't here, you can't have no argument in corporate America. If you ain't here, you can't go to church. If you dead, you ain't got no conversation. You're being conversed about, but you don't have a conversation to have. So this is why it's important to start with the police, because if I can't assume that when you stop my car fishing for a reason to get me into trouble, and then it ends with, like Walter Scott with me being killed, Sandra Bland with me being dead 2 or 3 days later, then we don't have the baseline of protection that allows us to move forward. So it's extremely important to do that. And by the way, the police issue is one that joins Black Lives Matter, Ms. Garza et al., with an Al Sharpton. Reverend Al Sharpton, right? We talk about Big Luther, Small Luther. We talk about Big Al, Small Al. We talk about still had the same hair, cold-blooded. He had the James Brown follicular fidelity because he paid homage to the man who loved him. And he said, if you love me, then put your hair like mine. So Al Sharpton, if you turn it to sideways and look at a silhouette, I dare you to tell me the difference between Al Sharpton and George Washington. Oh boy. That's a political re-excavation, an excavation of a political orientation that's deeply entrenched in American democracy. That gives new meaning to Whig and Tory. But anyway, I digress. The point is that Al Sharpton, when he was in those running suits, and when Negroes thought he was out of control and he ain't our leader and he doesn't have the right class, he was talking about police brutality. Bourgeois Negroes thought that's for you Negroes in the street who be messing up. Those of us who abide by the law shall not be attacked. God darn it, and it seems that is everywhere. It metastasized. So Al Sharpton was really a point man for a prescient understanding that the central argument about Black life in terms of a post-civil rights 1960s movement would be the police. Garza et al. Come along and they revive that sense, but reinfuse it with new meaning. Now they began to attach layers of gender, of sexual orientation, of class, and they began to articulate the necessity for a new generation to grasp hold of this. So in the minds of my colleagues and the people who are responding, Ms. Garza is so right. Why give up on the language that allowed you to articulate an ideal so deep and profound that you knew it was doing something because it made white folk uncomfortable and it made comfortable Negroes uncomfortable. So for me, it's extremely important to hold fast to that. Look at Colin Kaepernick. 4 years ago, bowing down on the gridiron, trying to be respectful. Mr. Nate Boyer tells him, hey, I'm a veteran. If you want to honor veterans, then kneel. And so he did that. He was demonized. Now the man has got a statue somewhere. He might be up there next to Kobe and Magic Johnson somewhere. Now they want to put him on a dollar bill. Okay, that's a lie. But what I'm saying is that there is a transition suddenly, but the sudden is not sudden. The sudden is a buildup. Black Lives Matter was the wave that crashed against white supremacy for 150 years. Miss Garza and her colleagues simply named it. And when they named it, they were able to give it an identity, and that identity had seen it through. Yes, there is resistance. Yes, there is nastiness. You know, look, I've been getting death threats for 32, 34 years. I've been out here doing it. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have Twitter. They just wrote your old-fashioned nasty notes, and then they saw you in the street. There's that nigger. Yeah, that's me. I'm the one. I'm the one. Yep, NWA. That's what I do. So the reality is, in my time and with my colleagues and with older people, we look and we celebrate what is going on with this movement, politically, socially, spiritually, metaphysically, and I think symbolically. All that brought together, and my generation says, hats off. We acknowledge what's going on. We want to continue to forge connections. And it's upsetting a lot of white folk, but it's also setting a lot of white folk right. They have a language to hold on to. And it's something that's precise and concise for them to say, yeah, Black Lives Matter. And that notion, if they keep saying it, even as a mantra. And I know Ms. Garza said, don't just put it on your shirt, but put it on your shirt. Don't just put it on your website, put it on your website. Don't just put it on your books, put it on your books. And also put it on something else, right? And I think that, look, it's like with romantic love. You can't live on romantic love for 30 years and 40 years. No, you can't, but you need it to start. And you need it as the kindling to be on the fire. So we need the branding of Black Lives Matter. That's the ingenuity of this generation. We need to Facebook and social media, all that stuff, but we need to connect it to deeper wells of social resistance and political intensity that allow us to leverage our history in new forms. So we have to thank Black Lives Matter as often as we can, because they've given us new energy, new insight, and new purpose for our social rebellion. And white folk are listening, and that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. And something else I believe this moment has given us is a deep awareness of the toll that being an advocate for racial equality has on someone mentally and physically and spiritually. And we're having conversations, as you noted, about the importance of self-care and taking care of yourself mentally in ways that perhaps were not as common. And it would be great to hear your insight and your counsel there.
I can start here. I mean, it's a very important question, and I think it's one that deserves a broad answer. I have to be honest that I have realized over the last decade that I can't yoga my way to care. I can't bubble bath my way to care. That actually care and caring and connection and interdependence is a cultural value that we have to adopt. If I'm doing my things to buy myself care, then there are still people in my community that can't access that. And so I like to talk about self-care as a function of community care. And I do the work that I can to make sure that the environments that I'm building, the work that I do at the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund and other institutions and organizations, we really build into our culture that we need people to be long distance runners. And so what that means is a different mindset and approach, right, to how we do this work and connecting to purpose, right, in addition to connecting to outcomes. So, every week when my team and I are talking about the work that we're getting ready to move, we start with just checking in with each other. What do people need? Are you feeling anxious? How can we show up for you? And that's different than telling people to take a day off or take a week off or take a bubble bath or sending somebody a pass for yoga. And I think this is important because so often, at least over the last decade, there's been lots of debates about self-care and, whether or not self-care is accessible, whose idea is that? People quote Audre Lorde, but then they quote her wrong. We have to understand that, part of what it means to be an act of political warfare is to change the way that we orient and organize ourselves around the work that has to be done. The work of changing policies and changing laws is not separate from the work of changing culture and changing our relationships to each other that have been shaped by systems that deem us disposable. And so if we are adopting those practices and habits and trying to wash over them and call them something that they're not without fundamentally changing them, then we are literally just advancing a political agenda that is not ours and it's not beneficial to us. And so in this moment where we are constantly pivoting because the systems that organize our lives are actually deeply unsustainable, and so they tend towards crisis, we have to do a readjustment of ourselves in this moment, not just to provide mutual aid, which is important, not just to make sure that people are caring for themselves, which is important, but to actually change our practices so that care is at the center of the work that we do externally and internally. And it provides infrastructure, or a safety net, as some people might say, to, not just the freedom fighters who are out in the streets right now, but all of the people who are working to make social change real. And so we have to, I think, readjust our way of understanding care from an individual's responsibility to access as they can to environments and cultures that we nurture, that care for each other as much as we care for ourselves.
Amen.
Professor Dyson, thoughts on self-care, how individuals can care for themselves as they're trying to engage these really difficult topics?
Well, Ms. Garza has brilliantly, eloquently articulated it. I'll just add a couple things. When we find the way to have radical, revolutionary Black joy in the midst of Black pain, then the therapeutic possibilities are opened up and we learn to embrace them without shame. Let's not shame each other, but let's embrace the possibility of our self-care because we care for each other. Self-care is critical, other care is mandatory, and we care for each other is the fundamental premise, I think, of Black survival in this country.
Well, it has been a joy and a privilege having you both with me, and I appreciate you caring enough about this topic to share your time with me and all of our listeners. And we hope to be able to continue this at another time and to follow both of you all on your journeys, on your work, and on social media.
Thank you, my friend. You do great work at the Washington Post, man. I read you all the time. You're brave, you're courageous, you're insightful, you're chocolate charming and handsome Hollywood, brother. You're doing your thing.
And now, a very special treat with Robert McDuffie, a dear friend of the Aspen Ideas Festival.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robert McDuffie, here to play for you. Oh, how I wish I could be with all of you in Aspen. This would have been my 44th consecutive summer at Aspen. Yes, I'm a fiddle player. I usually go to the music festival. That's what brings me to Aspen, and I've had such a great time there. While I've improved as a violinist because of the festival, I think I've become a more informed citizen because of the Institute over all these many years and having the honor to audit many seminars and perform for you as part of the Ideas Festival. I will never forget one summer when I audited Justice and Society and Justice Harry Blackmun moderated this very motley crew of intellectuals sitting around this table. Great experience. And then several years later, ended up playing for Kitty and Ideas Festival, the most memorable being a letter from Birmingham Jail with Anna Devere Smith. I'm going to play for you a beautiful song by the great composer Fritz Kreisler. It's called Liebeslied, or Love's Sorrow, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it's a good way to close your amazing virtual festival. Thank you so much.
And now, an Aspen Ideas conversation with Dan Porterfield and Brian Greene.
Hello, I'm Dan Porterfield, President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. I'm joined by Brian Greene, Professor of Physics and Mathematics at Columbia University. Hey Brian, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you.
I've really been enjoying plowing through this amazing work until the end of time. What number book is this for you?
This is the fourth book for adults. I had one for kids in the middle of that.
Well, it's incredible. I've loved watching the arc of your career as a scientist and a public intellectual, and a creator. And it's so great for us to have you here today for the Ideas Festival to be able to talk a little bit about how you started, some of the formative ideas you developed as you were a student, and then let's get to the book. So, first of all, I know you are a New Yorker. How did you first get interested in science?
Well, it's actually one very specific day. I went to the planetarium. I grew up across the street from the Hayden Planetarium in New York. And one day I was heading back to school after a school trip to the planetarium. And I felt so tiny. We were like thinking about stars and galaxies and other worlds. And it just made me feel so tiny. So I started to ask the questions that everybody asks. But I asked them in a sort of really intense way, like, why am I here? What is the point of it all? And it just struck me walking back to school that if there was an answer, everybody would know it by now. But since no one ever told me the answer, it was clear that there wasn't a universal answer. And therefore, rather than trying to answer that question, I said, what if I shifted a little bit, not to why am I here, but how am I here? How is there an Earth? How is there a universe? How are there galaxies? And that really is what propelled me to physics.
You and I have been friends for years, and I've heard some of the stories about your education. And one thing I've always been struck with was that you had very good science education, math education when you were coming up in New York City. And say a word about that.
Well, I went to public schools. I went to PS 87 and IS 44, but if you have great teachers, right, you don't have to be at some fancy private school. And so I had these wonderful teachers who realized that I was able to do math pretty well, and they allowed me to go fast at my own pace. And when I exhausted what the school could provide, my teacher gave me a little letter. He said, go to Columbia University with this letter. And I did with my sister. We knocked down doors, gave the letter. Most people read it and gave it back. I didn't even know what the letter said. But one guy I gave it to, and he read it and he said, sure, I'll teach you, and I said, for free. And then I met with him 3 days a week over the summer and during the year on Saturdays. And I took off into all these areas of mathematics that I never would have encountered if it wasn't for this guy, Neil Bellinson, who really opened the world of math to me as a young kid.
So then you went to college at Harvard, and what was the quality of the education that you received there?
Not bad, Well, of course, Harvard has the greatest mathematicians and the greatest scientists in the world. They're not always the greatest teachers. So I'm not saying that every class that I took was really something where I would think of it as the model of pedagogy. But to hear from the very people that are pushing the boundary of understanding, there's something deeply exciting about that. So you really felt you were in the midst of science in the making, and that just gets you excited. And that's a big part of the process itself.
You've always had so many diverse interests in culture, the arts, politics, society. And is that how you were when you were in high school and in college, or did that come later?
No, definitely later. I was pretty single-minded when I was younger. It was just math.
Yeah.
It's the only thing that I really cared about. And in fact, I hated reading when I was a kid, and that sort of spilled over all the way to college. I mean, in college, when I would go to the bookstore to get a textbook for, say, my physics class, I'd crack it open. If there are a lot of words, my heart sank. If there are a lot of equations, I was like, yes, this will work, And it was really later on. It was really at Oxford, where you and I, of course, both met, that shifted for me. Because when I graduated college, I went through a period of deep regret. I felt like I got a technical training in math and physics. And I was like, I had this opportunity to explore the world of ideas. And all I did was push forward in one direction. I'd been on that trajectory for 20 years. And so when I got to Oxford, I sort of felt like, here's a chance.
One of our conversations, that one of the things you hope to do was to popularize science, make it accessible and exciting to more people. And then Brian and I joined a writing group where we were each sharing with some other students things we were working on. And you came into that group. You weren't giving us mini lectures. You were giving us plays, as I remember. So say a little bit about that opportunity to start to think of yourself as a writer.
Yeah, that was a great and unexpected, really, gift to learn about that group. And I think I probably learned about it from you. And you know, to be able to write in a way that wasn't trying to communicate rigorous ideas of science, but rather trying to communicate something of experience and the human condition and how we react to things, and try to put that together into a narrative or a story or a play, for me was kind of a turning point in my recognition of what you could do with words and language.
I remember you're being interested in or struck by some of the absurdities of life. And we sometimes talked about literature, Milan Kundera maybe, that pointed to that. And is that something that somehow relates to your work as a theorist?
Yeah, deeply so. You know, not when I'm, say, solving Schrodinger's equation of quantum mechanics, although there's some absurdity to that too, but that's a whole different discussion. But, you know, when I was young, I had an unexpected introduction to Camus. My dad had a copy of The Myth of Sisyphus, and it was all about the absurd. It was all about, you know, the deep questions of, is life worth living when you recognize that there doesn't seem to be some overarching purpose to things. So I feel like my life's work has been on one trajectory, trying to understand the physical universe as deeply as possible. But the other trajectory is to recognize that the more we understand, the more it seems clear that there is no overarching purpose. So the deeper we go into physics, to me, makes it seem all the more absurd in the sense of Camus. But of course, Camus found a way to find meaning even in an absurd universe. And in a sense, that's what my new book is really about, in some sense, the journey that gets you to that. But for me, it's a cosmological journey that gets me to that point, whereas, you know, the great existentialist philosophers got there from a different trajectory.
How did the book itself, which is this exploration of time and meaning, physics, how did it even come together for you to do this book?
Well, you know, I'd written a few books before, as you noted, and they were all really about bringing cutting-edge science to a general audience. String theory, space-time, relativity, quantum mechanics, all that stuff. But every time I was writing one of those books, it felt to me there was a whole nother story waiting to be told, which is, how do these insights not just give us a deeper sense of how the world works, but how do they affect our sense of who we are and how we fit into the larger picture? And I don't know, when I was younger, it just didn't seem that I had the standing, or it didn't seem the time was right to take on those big philosophical issues. And now, as the years passed, I felt like I was really ready to do that. And so I just launched in, and this was the result.
So one of the things that you write about, a critical important thing, is that trying to take a cosmic timeline. Yeah. And what does that mean?
Well, we all have a sense of the timescales of the everyday, the timescales of our lives. But what I wanted the reader to get a deep sense of is, how does that timescale fit in to the cosmological unfolding from the Big Bang to the closest that science can take us to what might be called the end. And when you follow that grand sweep, which is enormous timescales, I take you in this book from time zero, if you will, out to 10 to the 100 years from now. We're at like 10 to the 10 years now. And that exponent, that's an exponential difference. And when you can see your life within this cosmological timeline, this cosmological landscape, to me, it gives you a radically different perspective, and one that I think can have an impact on how you think about yourself and think about your life.
What about the meaning part? With that cosmological time frame, the cosmic sense of the enormity of history, but also that time can end. Time will end, I guess, scientifically speaking. How then do you derive meaning out of that?
Well, that's really, in some sense, what the book is about. I mean, when you learn that stars disintegrate and planets disintegrate and life itself disintegrates, and even, as I argue in the book, consciousness has a finite duration on the cosmological timeline, it can leave you with a sense of, what's the point of it all? It all goes away. And if your sense of meaning is derived from legacy and from looking to the future, then yeah, that's going to crumble in time. And the argument that I make in the book is actually a very familiar one. It's that we need to focus on the here and now, something we've heard of from philosophers and mindfulness teachers and sages across the ages. So it's nothing novel from that perspective. But the way I take you there from this cosmological perspective and this recognition that it all disintegrates, to me adds a heft and a weight to the arguments that focus you here. And it also is the journey that I went through. I did have dark periods when I began to better understand what would happen in the far future. And I myself went through a transformation where I recognized that the focus needs to be here as opposed to there, because there disintegrates.
Some people having that same experience of wonder that you had as a child, and then deep reflection, find themselves sensing the presence of a larger creating other. That how could all this come together, but with some form of design?
Yeah.
You've been thinking about that question for years, I bet. How do you answer that today when people bring that to you?
Well, first, they may be right. Behind it all, there could be some intelligence that has set it all up and then sat back and let it all unfold. It's very difficult to prove that that perspective is wrong, but I don't see any evidence for it. And I'm drawn, when I'm talking about the objective qualities of the external world, to things that do have evidence, experiment, observation behind them. However, unlike many of my colleagues, which kind of I find tragic and heartbreaking, who go out into the world and say, we want to rid the world of religion. Religion is something from the infancy of the species. It's time to outgrow it. That's not my perspective at all, because the objective world, that's important to understand. I've dedicated my life to doing so, but the subjective world of inner experience, of conscious self-reflection is just as important. And for many people, not all, but for many people, a theological perspective, a religious perspective, let me call it a spiritual perspective, is something that can illuminate your own place and your own reactions and your own sense of self. And that journey is just as important as the journey to understand the objective world. So I think there is a deep and important place, so long as you recognize that you can't use religion to calculate the electron's magnetic moment to 10 decimal places. That's the purview of quantum field theory. But once you realize that there are different kinds of questions and different journeys, there is a place for both.
So it's an integration of your ability to think in terms of philosophical and physical concepts with other dimensions of life. It's not one or the other.
Exactly.
How does it inform? Would you call it a materialist perspective, or what is it that you define as this perspective that takes the cosmic timeline?
Well, it is a materialist perspective or a physicalist perspective. It's the recognition that, well, there's no proof of this, but all the available evidence suggests that it's just stuff out there governed by physical law. Yeah. We are, in this language, nothing but bags of particles governed by the laws of physics. Yeah. And sometimes when I say that, people feel like I'm denigrating what it means to be human, but actually I feel like I'm aggrandizing it, because once you recognize that all you are is a bag of particles governed by physical law, and when you realize that that bag of particles can do things like write the Ninth Symphony, or build the pyramids, or paint the Mona Lisa, or write King Lear, you say to yourself, wow, look at what particles governed by physical law can accomplish. How spectacular is that? So to me, it really is adding a certain kind of wonder to what we can do as opposed to taking it away.
How does this help you ground a sense of your personal morality or personal ethics?
It's an interesting question and a deep one, because I, for instance, do not believe in free will. I believe that the arguments that we're touching upon here establish that every action we take is the product of physical law acting on the constituents that make us up. And some people say, well, if you don't have free will, then morality is gone, moral responsibility is gone. And I do not think that is true at all. I think that we are responsible for what our particles do, period, end of story. It's our particles. The question is, should we be punished? And here's where the issue, I think, shifts a little bit, because if punishment is for retribution, I don't see any role for it. If punishment is for education, either for the individual or those who are watching the punishment being doled out, you can learn even if you don't have free will. My Roomba going around the house learns where my furniture is, even though it doesn't have free will. And so if punishment is in that guise, a consequentialist perspective, punishment is to shape future behaviors, then I think that is a absolutely justifiable way to dole out punishments.
And do you mean this shaping as a form of conditioning?
In some sense, if you want to use that language, but in the end of the day, our behaviors are a product of our genetic makeup, our physical makeup, and that is affected by the stimulus that we receive and the responses that we yield across our lives. And so, yeah, if I see something in the world, some action undertaken, and I see that agent being punished for that action, my particles can rearrange in a manner that says, hey, I don't want that to happen to me.
I love this conversation. It throws me back to standing outside of potato trucks on High Street.
We met there every
in
night
Aspen, almost every night. But I don't buy it, because you made the choice to write 4 books, and your particles are the only particles on the planet Earth that could have written those books. Don't tell me they were pre-written and you just happened to grab them. So how do you account for that?
Well, so it's a good point, and you're right. The individual has a particulate arrangement that is iconic, that is special, and therefore your actions reflect your particle arrangement. So I agree that when Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony, it was Beethoven's particles that had the capacity to do that. But did they freely do that? No. Did I freely write my books? I do not, in the conventional sense that I can claim that the actions originated fully and totally within me, that I somehow transcended the forces in the world around me and was able to do something that was not the product of those physical laws acting on my particles. No.
Okay, but still, if we don't have unlimited freedom, doesn't it mean that we have some freedom?
Yeah. So I would say the answer to that is yes, but the kind of freedom you may not find satisfying, which is this. I have a greater range of behavioral responses available to me than does a rock. The rock just sits there regardless of what you do to the rock, because it doesn't have the internal organization to respond in a rich spectrum of behaviors. So I have this rich spectrum of behaviors. I don't choose them. But yet, if the stimuli from the environment are slightly different, my responses will be different. And there are a range of responses that I can give. One such response is writing a book. And a rock doesn't do that. So it's not freedom from physical law. It's freedom from the constrained behavior that governs the inanimate world. And I am thankful for that behavior. But look, if I write a good sentence or solve an equation, I don't take credit from it in the way that we usually think about it. I did it. I say to myself, hey, particles, nice job. I'm really pleased that the forces came together to yield that outcome. And I'm not joking here. This is how I really think about how we fit into the world.
Well, let me just say this. My particles love your particles. You are an awesome person, an incredible teacher, a creator, and a great friend. And it's been just a pleasure to host you today.
Well, thank you. I feel the same way. So this is a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
The Aspen Ideas Festival is generously underwritten by Allstate, the Mount Sinai Health System, Prudential, and the Walton Family Foundation, with support from PayPal and the Rise Fund. And now, a big idea presented by Aspen Ideas Health.
Hello, everybody. My name is Phumzile Mlambo Nguga. I'm the Executive Director of UN Women. My big idea is to rapidly close the digital divide. and power it with renewable energy. More than half of the people on the planet right now have no access to connectivity, and that exacerbates inequality. Today, it is possible to bring connectivity to billions of people through wireless, through other means that do not require big infrastructure. We can use clean and renewable energy and save the planet in the process.
For our next Aspen Ideas conversation, we have Lulu Miller and Krista Tippett.
I'm Krista Tippett of the On Being Project and the On Being podcast, and I'm excited to be here with Lulu Miller, my partner in crime in radio, who has also written a wonderful book called Why Fish Don't Exist. And as we get into that and what this beautiful exploration she did has to do with the world we're living in, I'm going to read a little bit, Lulu, from the very first lines. Picture the person you love the most. Chaos will get them. Chaos will crack them from the outside with a falling branch, a speeding car, a bullet, or unravel them from the inside with the mutiny of their very own cells. Chaos will rot your plants and kill your dog and rust your bike. It will decay your most precious memories, topple your favorite cities, wreck any sanctuary you can ever build. It's not if, it's when. Chaos is the only sure thing in this world, the master that rules us all. My scientist father taught me early that there is no escaping the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is only growing. It can never be diminished, no matter what we do. A smart human accepts this truth. A smart human does not try to fight it. So here we are, in a year that has become 2020. And this book traces how this way of seeing the world was formed you from the very beginning of your life. And it also explores the limitations of this way of moving through the world. And I'm so curious to hear how you would start thinking about how this exploration is infusing the way you are living through our rupturing, unfolding world right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Krista. It is truly surreal to be here with you. Like really, really nerve-wracking and surreal. You have been not just a legend in our world, but someone who has given me a, as you can tell from that introduction, at times depressive, terrified atheist, a lot of help along the way as an adult person. So it's really cool to be talking to you. And yeah, I mean, basically this book started out almost 10 years ago as an exploration, honestly, as a craving for an antidote to the feeling of chaos. I grew up with this kind of hilarious, nihilistic atheist father who was taking every chance he could to sort of shove it down our throats, my sisters and I, that there's no point to anything, there's no meaning, there's no God, there's no afterlife, you're about, chaos made you and will kill you quickly. So go live your life. And it's like the carpe diem side of that is, if we're all going to go and there's no point, go do what you want, take the risk, have fun. Yeah. He kind of was this like moralistic, he is a moralistic kind of hedonist. And so on some days, I thought, if I just accept that, I'll be like Dad, I'll be happy and present and kind of connected with the world. And on some days that worked, but then on other days, I think when just the world throws its tougher blows or is cruel in certain ways, that thought could really darken things, as I think it can for everybody. Well, if the point of life is nothing except to taste it, and tasting it feels horrible, that could quickly transmute to why stay. And I think, I get the sense that people who are raised with faith, certain faith, at times when they have the question, why stay, they encounter a barrier in their mind because it's forbidden to go, or because if you stay there might be heaven. And I think that at that moment I would sometimes encounter like a slide with light saying, you know, there's no point to any of this, so why stay? And so that was just this personal, at times sort of, you know, even like shameful question to walk around with. And I do have to say, especially in this moment, that is one of the key questions of the book, like a white girl wondering whether to stay against the context of Black lives who don't even have the choice, whose lives are being taken. I have to say that question itself comes from a huge place of privilege. But I do think depression is kind of an equal opportunity employer and does affect people. And we see, you know, people struggling with exhaustion right now. And anyway, so that question was sort of, is at the heart of this book, which is in many ways just the story of a scientist. And I think where I came out at the end of it, I wanted an antidote to chaos, to those feelings, to that destruction. And I think where I came out at the end was realizing, no, the way forward is to embrace that chaos and to squint at it differently. And we can talk more about that, but my relationship to chaos itself, I think, changed by the end, in part because of this guy who the book is.
Well, and you set out, you kind of had an object of your fixation. And there's a story in here about stories we never heard. And let me just say it this way. I think what you have been pursuing and starting to look for and really turning over all kinds of interesting rocks and looking for is the very way we have thought about order and made order and trusted in order. And that also feels so resonant to me. You know, this year, even, twice, I mean, going through the pandemic, the lockdown, feeling like in that moment, understanding that we have a world to remake, in part for many reasons, but in part around the way we had this civilizational moment of defining what is essential and non-essential and realizing we hadn't organized our world to value what we call essential. And then, of course, moving into this rupture, this racial, what I hope is an awakening, that also absolutely challenges the way we've structured our life together. And it feels to me like you have been on this quest to think about science as a participant in that, both as a companion to that kind of inquiry, also understanding the limits of science in that inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so the book is about this man, David Starr Jordan, who's a taxonomist. His day job is to make order. Taxonomy is the profession that tries to find the hidden order of life, how things are created on the evolutionary tree. And he sort of was trained in this idea that there was actually a moral hierarchy in nature. He had a teacher, Louis Agassiz, who told him that God had created creatures and plants in a specific order, and that the higher up they are on this ladder, the better they are, the closer to God. And the work of taxonomy was to figure out the thoughts of God. David Starr Jordan would eventually sort of let go of that idea when he came to accept Darwin, but actually it insidiously still clung to him. And he came to believe that time had still forged an objective, scientifically objective order in nature among creatures and eventually among humans.
And I would say that idea infuses the modern world we inherited.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was such an important lesson, that we think, we look back maybe on some of these measures they used to use, that posture revealed godliness, that, humans stood upright facing heaven, as they called it, whereas fish lay prostrate in the ground. And we think we're beyond that kind of idea, but we just use different measures, and they're just rampant. We see it with COVID. Someone might not be as likely to get a ventilator if they have pre-existing conditions. And what does that mean? What created those pre-existing conditions? Who are we leaving out on what we're creating these hierarchies all the time. They are entrenched in our law. there are still stuff on the books about how certain kinds of people are legally allowed to get sterilized.
Right. And David Starr Jordan, and I have to confess I hadn't heard his name before. If I had, I hadn't memorized it.
Yeah.
I was very surprised when I got to the point where he becomes the founding president of Stanford University.
Yeah, and he was huge there. He was there for over a decade, and there's still a big building named after him, and he was remembered in many ways incredible, in a really positive, sunny light, because he happened to be so prolific at catching fish, and he was apparently a very charming and passionate educator. But he advanced this idea of an order among humans more and more in his life. And yeah, I mean, this book really ends up being basically an exploration of the dangers of the lust for order. And on one hand, like, this desire to name things, to group things into categories, it's so primal. Yes. Like, we need it a little bit, but it can really lead us astray. And for me, one of the biggest discoveries of the book was even the word order itself. It comes from the Latin ordenum, which was for a loom. It's the way that threads sit in a loom in an organized way. And that itself is also so violent and fabricated. Like, we stuff things together, we stuff threads together. It began to be used metaphorically for the way that, like, people in a, army may sit under a king or ruler in an order that we've created. And it was only extended to nature in the 1700s. It was like this superimposition that there is any hierarchy to find there. And I think, one of the most important things that we can do with our fleeting time is to just remember that any order is fabricated. Behind every ruler, there's a rule.
There's some line that you have. Every category is at best a proxy, at worst a shackle.
Right. And I think, some of these ideas can seem really abstract and, why do fish not exist? Who cares about a taxonomist? But these categories are just, they're all around us. And we take things for granted all the time about, whether, who deserves a loan, who deserves to go to a school. These are categorical, value judgments that we're placing on the world. And I think just walking around aware that order is fabricated, and it's our job to be curious about the mistakes we're making and the inconsistencies and the nuance that we're obscuring with these proxies, with these labels.
And that something that we constructed, we can deconstruct and reconstruct.
Right, and that this moment, disorder all around, protest, rebellion, riot, like, this is the moment. This is a moment of so much potential, and to realize, that, like, it is the job, especially for people sitting near the top of that hierarchy, to listen and to embrace, like, what are the messages, coming from people who are unfairly trapped in a very, crushed by this fabricated order, and to sort of, even when discomfort and disorder might intuitively in our body feel really bad, like, just to realize, oh my gosh, this is the path forward. This is the best thing. And so that has definitely reframed this moment. I would like to think I'd be curious already. Like, I would like to think that, but I do think sitting around and thinking about the dangers of order for almost 10 years has made me, at the very least, curious about the dangerously constructed orders in my own mind and in my own life. As a journalist, what hierarchies am I making? What I've been thinking a lot about, even just what I have been taught and have come to believe makes a good story, and what has that been leaving out, and where do I need to do work there?
I'd like to talk to you about that for an hour. Yeah. Would you so one kind of big discovery that, again, well, maybe this is part of this story. Why was this not a headline? Why was this not on the front page, that fish do not exist? Describe that discovery, how that is true.
It is so bonkers. Okay, so this isn't me being a woo-woo lady.
No, this is you being a science reporter.
But it's been well accepted in scientific circles since the 1980s. This is not a controversial idea. So basically, here's what it is. Fish, what I'm saying is that the category of fish as a scientifically meaningful category is just absolutely a bunk category. It does not exist. It's not meaningful in the same way that birds actually is meaningful. mammals actually is meaningful. But if we're talking about creatures that are related to each other, all groups of all descendants of one ancestor with no extras, fish is no good. And so it's like saying, all creatures that are loud and purple is a group. Like, sure, fish is a category you can make, but it doesn't tell you much about actual evolutionary closeness.
But what they have in common that we can observe, that we have let absolutely define our sense of their place in the universe, is very superficial.
Yeah. So basically, swimming in the water in these costumes of scales and tails. Right. There are creatures far more closely related, for example, to us or to a cow than they are to one another. And when you start to really accept that and look that in the face, you realize, okay, so I've got two options. I can either say that all those other creatures should be included in fish, so throw a cow in, throw your mom in, that, those are fish. Or the more useful thing to say is that fish is not a meaningful category. It never was. It's a category we sort of gerrymander certain things together and put things that don't belong to preserve a sense of distance from creatures that we like to think of as lower than us. Whereas beneath those scales are sort of more all kinds of complexity than we may not realize. There's cognitive complexity, all sorts of things. And so yeah, it's just like a bunk gerrymandered category.
Yeah, and of course, reading it right now, in this moment, it's like race, right? Race is also a human invention, a construct, but such a powerful construct around which we have shaped and actually distorted ourselves, our bodies, our minds, and our structures. And I found, the story you're telling, and this way that science, I think what's great about science actually, there's just not every scientist in a moment of having what they work to prove disproven, but there is this excitement about hitting a limit and learning that you have a whole new set of questions to ask and a whole new world of discovery to walk into. Yeah. And that's then, in this different civilizational context, I feel like this is a story for our time.
Yeah, I would hope so. It is, and like I'm using it for myself as just the reminder of, okay, Lulu, you are riddled with blind spots. And like, what do you need to learn right now? What do you need to change? What order do you need to take down? In the book, I focus more on the connection between fish and the concept of unfit, which was a term eugenicists used to sterilize.
Well, and eugenics is in this story of David Starr Jordan too.
Hugely, yeah.
Which means it's inside our cultural story, and of all the things we're taking apart right now to examine, I feel like that's a thread that we haven't named.
Yeah, absolutely. And just this concept of, what words do we slap on the world? Like they were using this term unfit to just talk about a catch-all of people that largely white male people didn't think should be around. And so that could be someone with...
Or have babies.
Right. Yeah. And they're sort of, all kinds of different ideas were discussed, including legalizing polygamy for the rich white upper classes. The eugenicists entertained all kinds of ideas, and the American eugenicists settled on this path of sterilization, which they saw as the humane way of basically cutting off a lifeline. They saw that as the humane alternative to extermination, which was a word that was used a lot. And yeah, in that category was just all kinds of things. It had this very sober Darwinian sounding term, unfit. And then inside was just people who they didn't like. And that could be anything from someone with disabilities, someone with epilepsy, someone with a criminal background, someone who had a low score on a standardized test that was fabricated by the people in power. And it was just this messy, judgmental idea that they stuffed into a scientific sounding suit. And again, that's not gone. That's not gone from our laws. No. Now we use terms maybe like mentally incapacitated or unable to give informed consent, but these things are still with us.
Or really, I think you could also see it kind of embedded in the way in what our prisons have become.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This sense of human beings who are disposable.
Yeah.
Who are ruined and not worth treating as human beings.
And there's so many, like word choice. You had Resmaa Menakem on the show recently and how he uses the word cages to really drive that point. And Ruthie Wilson, popular, huge prison abolitionist and police abolitionist, just the reminder, like, these are cages, and that when you can change a word or look under, what are the assumptions under a word, and look at the words we're using. Yeah, there is a lot. I mean, there's just, it feels like if anything, there's just this question of why now? Why do white people care now? And if anything, I think it just feels hopeful, but it also feels, I don't know if you share this, like as a white person, just, it feels shameful to be so late.
Yeah.
But there is change. And I think the path forward is just a real openness to every word we are using, every assumption we believe in what creates order in society, because that, as people have been saying for a long, long time, needs a profound rethinking.
Yes, it's shameful. It's so many things, and we have to work with it, and we have to walk forward, and we have to reimagine the future and remake the world. And I think part of the story you tell is how very much we have crafted the world, and how we do that with our words and with our categories, that there's a power to those things that we could also claim in a generative way.
Right. It can be, words are destructive and they're generative. They're not inert, but they can be all things. And that is so beautiful to, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder one other thing as we close, or as we wind down. So this is also a story of us in which optimism, I think, as you say, as a shield, does not fare well. But you did come out, and I actually don't like the word optimism. I think it's kind of wishful thinking. I like thinking about hope as something muscular, a choice that works with reality. And you came out, and I think this is the way you come at it, with the dandelion principle, which is a way to work with the science, to work with the reality of chaos, and to live your life, and to claim life. So tell us about the dandelion principle, so the rest of us can walk around with it.
Yeah, this is the thing to end on. I wish I brought you some dandelions, but the great thing is they're all around, always there to remind us of this. So the dandelion principle is this idea for what is essentially a very basic philosophical concept of relativity, which is that to a gardener, a dandelion may appear like a weed, a thing to be culled and thrown away. But to a chef, for instance, it may be a little bite of peppery deliciousness in a salad. To a painter, it might be a pigment. To an herbalist, it might be a way of soothing digestive ailments. It's this idea that they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, worth is in the eye of the exploiter, perhaps, or a better way to say it is just that worth is always subjective. And I think that as we walk around considering what we value, what we discount, just to have the knowledge that there may be value beyond our comprehension. And that, actually, funnily enough, Darwin writes about this. He talks, he warns humans about the infallibility of, man's ability to see the value of nature. And he says, man can only act on appearances, nature can act on the whole machinery of life. And he strongly urges against meddling, and just this sense that there is a deeper connectivity, that things may have value that we might not be able to perceive, that our eye is incredibly short-sighted. And at the end of the day, our strongest ingredient as a society is variety, is diversity. And you see that, of course, playing out in so many places, biodiverse ecosystems.
But also in being so humble towards even what really, for all kinds of objective, seemingly rational reasons, appears so insignificant.
Yes.
Would you read, in closing, from page 191, the passage that starts, On Neptune, it rains diamonds.
Sure. Okay, here we go. Oh, and I do feel compelled to say the wonderful artist Kate Samworth made illustrations, one for every chapter. So, yeah, okay. So, all right, here we go. On Neptune, it rains diamonds. It really does. Scientists figured that out just a few years ago. The longer we examine our world, the stranger it proves to be. Perhaps there will be a mother waiting inside a person deemed unfit. Perhaps there will be medicine inside a weed, salvation inside the kind of person you had discounted. When I give up the fish, I get, at long last, that thing I had been searching for, a mantra, a trick, a prescription for hope. I get the promise that there are good things in store, not because I deserve them, not because I worked for them, but because they are as much a part of chaos as destruction and loss. Life, the flip side of death. Growth of rot.
So chaos also untangles itself. And the chaos, what feels to us like chaos, is a new kind of order. And we are participants in that.
Yeah, we are. And that, right, as you were saying, our words, they can be horribly destructive and they can be profoundly generative. And we can change our words. We can change our systems. We actually can use our fleeting time on Earth to reconstruct a world order and to like the way, I mean, another thing I personally don't believe exists is a cosmic, a moral arc that pushes or pulls toward justice. I don't think it's there. I used to, growing up, I used to actually think by cherry picking a few moments in history that evolution somehow guaranteed this slow march toward better. I really don't anymore. But I do believe our words are the things, the bricks that construct it. Our actions are the things that can change things. And so it's not there, and that's haunting. It is not guaranteed. But then that reframes, for me, that reframes, honestly, the haunting question of the beginning. There's no point. Yeah, there really is. Like, your stupid tongue has the ability to create an alchemy with the words you say. Like Black Lives Matter has been saying for a long time. Say it, and maybe slowly, eventually, the idea becomes real. And so, yeah, that I think that is our job. That is why this time does matter.
Thank you, Lulu. And thanks to Aspen Ideas for bringing us together.
Thank you so much.
We'll conclude tonight with salient words from our archives from the late Reverend Peter Gomes.
See, the great question, I think, is not how do we exercise our power to avoid failure. I don't think that's the issue at all. The great issue is how do we use our power and our skills when failure inevitably attends our way? How do we manage when things don't turn out the way we would like? How do we manage when the ideal does not turn out to be the ideal? That's where courage, that's where the will is drawn in. And so to all of the things that we have heard and said and thought about in these happy, blessed Aspen days, I beseech us to add one further dimension, that interior dimension of will and purpose. Then these days will not have been spent in vain, and we may very well continue in that great pilgrimage which our ancestors began so long ago. When people say our best days are ahead of us, I truly believe that. And I believe that because we have been preceded by great souls. And that if we employ our own soul power in this enterprise, we will overcome any other energy crisis that the human mind can devise. Now, that's what I'm supposed to say, and I've said it. And you're supposed to listen to it and take it seriously. So the ball is now in your court.
We're so glad we could bring you the festival from this magical place that is the Aspen Institute campus in Aspen, Colorado. Though our venue has been radically different this year, splashed across thousands of screens rather than gathered in a tent in a mountain meadow, it serves to remind us that a great idea can come from anywhere. and that it is our duty to make sure those great ideas are shared around the world. It is our sincere hope that we will see you all next year. In the meantime, the serious work of the Aspen Institute will continue in cities and communities across the country and around the globe. Your support makes this work possible. Please consider making a tax-deductible donation at aspeninstitute.org/support2020.